great pleasure to welcome Joe Watkins, a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He currently works as a senior consultant for archaeology and cultural education consultants, and is an affiliated faculty member in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. He was president of the Society for American Archaeology during 2019 to 2021, and his study interests concern the ethical practice of anthropology and anthropology's relationships with descendant communities and populations on a global scale. We are also joined by Carol J. Ellick, who is the executive director of the Archaeological and Cultural Education Consultants. She is one of the leading archaeological educators in the US. She's given lectures, conducted workshops, delivered programs, and taught field schools in countries including Australia, Japan, Mexico, and New Zealand. And she is currently a designated campus colleague in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona and a research associate with the Center of Ainu, thank you, and Indigenous Studies at Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. So let's welcome them.
Good afternoon. It is on. It's just I speak very softly. I will probably be yelling in about 10 minutes or so after I get warmed up. But thank you very much for having us here. We're very excited to be here to talk about the Ainu, Japan, and our love affair with Hokkaido, if you will. So we're going to do sort of a tag team thing. We don't have it really planned out to the exact minute or so. So I may say something, Carol will correct me, and then I will grab the microphone, and we'll be wrestling up here. It'll be like worldwide wrestling. So.
And you wonder why I'm wearing a sling.
So, other than that, again, my name is Joe Watkins. I'm very happy to, this last year, working with the University of Arizona Press, to put together a project that we've been talking about, or I've been talking about, since at least 2008. The first time we went to Japan, to Hokkaido, was in December of 2007. We had a very quick trip. It was a 4-day trip. We got there on Thursday, gave presentations on Saturday, went to a museum on Sunday, and then had to fly out on Monday. We said, we wanted to stay longer, but our colleagues in Japan said, don't worry, we will invite you back. You'll be coming back more. And luckily, we have been able to. Again, the project, when we started, was looking at, well, we got invited to Hokkaido to give presentations and talks because in 2007, the Japanese government recognized the Ainu as Japan's indigenous population. And so after more than 100 years of the Japanese government saying, no, they're not any different, we're all just one population, they finally recognized that yes, the Ainu were distinct, were separate, had a different culture than the Wajin, the mainland Japanese. And so with that recognition of the Ainu as being distinct and different, colleagues were asking us to come over and talk about how things happen in the United States. We gave presentations about repatriation, about American Indian descendancy, how particular tribes determined who was and who was not a member, gave presentations about tribal sovereignty, really just about anything that both the Ainu, the Japanese government, Hokkaido University wanted to know about how they could help the Ainu become much more recognized both on a global scale, but really within Japan itself. So if you ask most people about the Ainu, if you ask the person on the street, most people will say, well, they disappeared long ago. Or they might say, I knew an Ainu once, but I'm not sure where they are. Many of them do not recognize the Ainu as distinct, and there are still many Ainu who have experienced enough discrimination that there are many who will not publicly admit to being Ainu unless they really know someone for a period of time. So, origins of the Ainu, people are still trying to figure out where the Ainu originated. We have archaeologists tell us, oh, good slide, there's Japan, Hokkaido, and the nearness to the East Asian continent. And so archaeologists will tell us that there are maybe 5 or 6 different pathways by which the first populations came into the Japanese archipelago and onto the island of Hokkaido. There's from the continent by what we now consider the Korean Peninsula. There are options of people who came into Hokkaido from Sakhalin island, now used to be a peninsula, perhaps by coming down through Kamchatka. So there are 4 or 5 different pathways that no one is really certain about. Genetically, the Ainu are fairly distinct from the Wajin, the mainland Japanese population. Archaeologically, the first people to come into Japan archipelago came about 30,000 years ago during what's called either the Middle Paleolithic or the Upper Paleolithic. It was a time of stone tool technology, beginnings of very particular types of stone tools. So I won't bore you non-archaeologists with technologies and such, but at that time period, there was primarily a single population of people inhabiting the Japanese archipelago. There might have been some slight differences on Hokkaido, especially northern Hokkaido, but in general, the population was very much homogeneous. So at about 13 to 15,000 years ago, a major cultural event happened where we get what's called the Jomon culture. We get the appearance of pottery. We get the appearance of groundstone tools. We get much more utilization of various different ecosystems. We start getting populations fishing, doing a lot of gathering of seashells, seafoods. So we get a population growth, we get a population change, and we get much more of a homogeneous cultural group appearing across the entire archipelago. That population, Jomon, is probably one of the primary roots that we can identify of the Ainu people of Japan. So the Jomon was a very long-lasting archaeological complex. It lasted until about 3,000 years ago. So about 3,000 BC, 5,000 years ago, we get another group of people, a population, coming into the island of Kyushu, then into Shikoku and onto Honshu, primarily from the Korean Peninsula. This group brought into the archipelago the practice of wet rice agriculture. Also brought in with it many of the ceremonial structures related to wet rice agriculture, administrative functions of that culture, as well as much more metal, iron, copper, bronze, these sorts of things. So with this Yayoi is the name of that group, with this Yayoi overlay, that's where we find the real foundation for contemporary Japanese culture, the Japanese state, the Kofun, and later what we now can see as the Japanese the development of the Japanese state. So with that Yayoi is where we see the real distinction between the Japanese mainland of Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Hokkaido. Because on Hokkaido, the climate is not one that really can allow wet rice agriculture. So Hokkaido archaeologically really stayed about the same as it was at 5,000 BC. So that separation of 3,000 years is what has allowed the Ainu to develop in place, if you will, in Hokkaido, in the northern parts of Honshu Island, on the island of Sakhalin, and a little bit on the Kuril Islands going up into Kamchatka. So with that archaeological distinction, as well as the genetic distinction between the mainland Wajin Japanese and the Ainu, we start getting the overlay of what the cultural differences, the historical differences, and we still see the expression of the genetic differences in many Ainu. Many of the Ainu phenotypically are very large face, have very larger skulls. Many of the Ainu men have beards, curly hair, so they look distinct from the more Japanese mainstream, mainland Japanese Ainu, Japanese Wajin. So with that, that's sort of a very brief background into what is currently, how the Ainu are currently recognized and distinct from the Japanese population on the mainland. So I'm going to take a bit of a break, turn it over to Carol for a bit of a conversation about our relationship with Hokkaido.
I totally unrehearsed, so we'll see how it goes. So Joe leads up to the point where there's this distinction between mainland Japan and Hokkaido. And that distinction is just a small body of water that separates the islands. But what ends up happening is that with the Ainu people maintaining their cultural identity on the island of Hokkaido, you have a major trade network which has begun between the mainland and the Wajin and the Ainu people. So there starts to be a distribution of from the mainland side, you've got the lacquerware and the metal objects coming up to Hokkaido. And from Hokkaido, you have a lot of fish and sea products going back down towards the mainland. So there's a network that begins being set up. I'm going to jump over now to talk about our relationship with things and how we kind of got involved with people and the community members that we worked with and the places that we've worked. As Joe said, when we got invited over in 2007, we were invited for 4 days. And the idea of going to Japan for 4 days was rather shocking. It's really, really far. It takes almost 4 days to get there, as far as I'm concerned. The good part of this was, by the time we got home, we hadn't been gone long enough, we never had any jet lag, which was awesome. But we got invited back the next summer to really begin our work, and our work crossed both continents, because as the Japanese government was trying to right the wrongs that had been done for centuries of trying to remove culture from the Ainu people, try to assimilate them very much in the same fashion as the US government and other colonizing governments have done to indigenous people, the Japanese government was very, very direct in how they did this. It was against the law to practice religion. It was against the law to speak the Ainu language. It was against the law to practice any traditional kinds of arts. And they wanted to just assimilate the Ainu into the Wajin, Japanese, more traditional culture. So now we're presented in 2007 with this issue of decades, centuries of discrimination and removal of culture. So the Japanese government is trying to go back and figure out how to undo the wrongs and how to give people back their culture. So they started looking beyond Japan to see what was going on in other countries where colonization had taken place. And we spent a great deal of time, not just in Japan, talking about issues of repatriation, about tribal identity, about starting cultural programs, about public education, to educate Japanese about what Ainu is and to try to remove some of the discrimination that had been burned into people's minds for generations. And they started looking at what went on in other places. So not only did we work with representatives from the Japanese government, the Ainu community, and the Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies at Hokkaido University in Japan, but we worked with various members of these communities when they came to the United States and visited Washington, D.C., and talked to people in the repatriation office at the National Park Service, talked to people at the Smithsonian, the Museum of American Indian. They came to, there's a picture in here of the group in Oklahoma when we were there, in front of a teepee. It was Native American Week, and there was a teepee on campus, and we took the group to the Chickasaw Cultural Center to show them an amazing example of a cultural center that was tribally run, tribally developed, and open to the public. From these things, they started developing ideas for how to go about doing repatriation, how to build a cultural center in Japan. What I saw as an issue was we again had the Japanese government, in a very patrilineal sort of way, direct how this was going to happen, not with a whole lot of input from the Ainu. And so one of the things that I did was I asked that question of, okay, you're doing a great job of going to museums and talking to government officials and finding out all of this from the colonizer perspective. But all of the things that have happened in the United States, repatriation being the biggest one, have had a huge impact on the Native American communities who now have to comply with the legislation that's been passed. So how are you going to talk to the Ainu people and include them in the decision making so there's not just an impact on them? And so we did a little study. One of our former students, who is now associate professor at Hokkaido University, and I did a little study where she came over and she actually went around. We talked to 3 different tribal communities here in Arizona to hear what they had to say about what they've had to do in order to work with the legislation that the United States government has imposed for repatriation. In meetings in DC, where we're listening to people talk about developing the repatriation and to think about how do you return ancestors to a community, their feeling was you look at the genetics, sometimes they actually, well, a lot of times they actually had the name tags of the people from the graveyards from the people had been removed for study in the medical schools. But the idea was always being talked about through the paternal lines. And I listened to this and I asked a very simple question. Well, traditionally are Ainu patrilineal or matrilineal? Do they follow the mother's line? Are the women the leaders? Who are the decision makers traditionally without the overlay of the Japanese government? And again, this got them thinking in a very different way about decision making. Not that it impacted much, but at least it made them think a little bit. There was the development of the National Museum for the Ainu. It was put in place right next to a living history museum that we visited in 2007 the first time, which was a living history museum. So you now have this big Japanese government developed National Museum of the Ainu and a living history museum working with each other in the town of Shiroi. And it is big and it is beautiful, and it has Ainu involvement, but again, it comes from a very Japanese perspective. A lot has changed and a lot has been added. Real simple idea, back in 2008, a 7th grade high school teacher came and talked to me about Ainu. They came to a public day on the site we were working on. And he said, there's nothing in the history books about Ainu. When he came back out to the site a year later, he said, there's now actually a chapter in the Japanese history book about Ainu. So slowly, that was 2008, 2009. So slowly these things started being incorporated. Hokkaido University Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies has its own building, it has its own staff, it has Ainu people who are working there, people who are managing programs and who are making decisions with the university and with governmental leaders on how things will go. So it's amazing what has actually been done in the not quite 20 years. But not even a full generation has passed. And it's going to take time, I think, to take this to probably the next level. Working with community, working with development for different communities to see the benefit for Ainu people and their knowledge and their skills to be highlighted. Right now there are basically 2 or 3 different Ainu communities which are actually looked to for their arts, for their museums, for their knowledge, for what they can do to bring in tourists. And that is the main draw that I see for what these Ainu communities represent to the Japanese government. The main one that is really growing and doing something is at Biratori and Nebutani. It's the community that was impacted greatly by the building of the Nebutani Dam. It basically wiped out their whole community when the flood levels were brought up after the dam was built. And now the Ainu community there is very strong. They have their own cultural center and some of the most amazing wood carvers bringing back the traditional wood carving of the Ainu people. So I'm going to, that's the Ainu folks and Japanese folks in front of the TP at University of Oklahoma. So I'm going to turn it back to Joe and see where he wants to go from there.
Thank you. I think part of the issue that we are seeing, both from a distance and based on our 20 years of going to Hokkaido, is the fact that currently the Ainu are trying to learn how to become an indigenous people. There are a lot of indigenous groups, a lot of groups of Ainu on Hokkaido. There are a couple of large groups on the island of Honshu in Tokyo. But right now there's, some of the issues are that there is no single Ainu government, if you will. There's the Hokkaido Ainu Association is a quasi-governmental organization established by the Japanese government in the 1930s. Its primary function was to take government programs that the Japanese wanted to impose upon the Ainu and make it palatable, if you will, for the Ainu. In other words, they would, sort of like the Bureau of Indian Affairs here in the United States. The Japanese government says, we want to do this. The Hokkaido Ainu Association finds a way to parse it out to the Ainu communities on Hokkaido. There were a large number of distinct Ainu communities on Hokkaido, and there still are, but as Carol was saying, there are some that really stand out. Biratori, Nibutani, Lekakan, Shari, Ushiri, a lot of different places that have people locally who practice Ainu culture. They're really like culture clubs, if you will. Every year, I think we have a couple of slides, every year in celebration of Shokshane, the Ainu's greatest warrior, if you will, all of the Ainu communities come together at a park and they provide homage to a statue of Shokshane. They have ceremonies, they conduct business, they conduct ceremonies to the ancestors, they have a large gathering meal, and the culture groups sing and dance, and they perform with each other and for each other. It's a celebration of all things Ainu, by the Ainu. And the Japanese government is still trying to find a way to harness that Ainu energy. Upapoi, the new museum, as Carol has said, it's everything that the Japanese government wants you to know about the Ainu. And it's a beautiful museum. The grounds are gorgeous. I really loved when we went to the museum at Shiraoi because it was still sort of almost like a 1950s version of the Ainu presenting themselves to the globe at that time. They had a couple of captive bears that you could spend 100 yen and feed the bears cookies. And you could go and visit the performances people did, dances. They demonstrated how to play the mouth harp, the makuri, and they really enjoyed interacting with people. Now at Upapoi, it's different. Upapoi does bring in a lot of income for Shiraoi and for the government, and that really fulfills the need of the Japanese government in that regard. Still, however, the Ainu have not been able to present their own history of what it means to be Ainu in Hokkaido 100 years ago, or even in Hokkaido today. So the Japanese government is trying to throw money at the Ainu problem, but they're doing it indirectly as well. Since there are no There's no real method for determining who is and is not Ainu. There are family registers that can trace some descendancy of Ainu back if one's family still has those registers. There's also mechanisms whereby the Japanese government has grants for communities, for Ainus to use for their communities, but those grants have to go through local Japanese townships or towns in order to get the funding. So if the Ainu have a good relationship with a local town like at Biratori, then the odds of getting funding are much higher. There are some communities still that do not like the Ainu because they consider them somewhat less Japanese. And so their relationship is not one that the local community is going to put in a request for funding for Ainu tourism. So there are still some issues that need to be worked out. We have a good colleague, Terry Tsunamoto, who is an attorney, was once the dean of the law school. He's the executive director of the Ainu Association, not the Ainu Association, the Ainu Foundation in Hokkaido, and they're the ones who are in charge of implementing policy. So Tsunamoto recognizes the differences, and he truly believes that it will take a change in the Japanese Constitution, because currently all Japanese citizens have the rights as every other Japanese citizen. So the Ainu, even though they are recognized as an indigenous population, that gives them no standing above and beyond any other Japanese. So we've been in conversations trying to figure out how to better develop programs, policies, and mechanisms whereby local communities can come up with some idea of some level of membership.
You keep talking about Ainu population. Can you hear me? I don't need that thing. Okay. When we first went to Japan, it was estimated that the Japanese population was about 23,000 people. Ainu population, sorry. And then it went down slightly, and then it went back up, and I got to wondering how this was calculated. And they said, well, there's a census, and in the United States we get that card that comes and you're supposed to fill it out, and it's at a household level, and they find out how many people and everything about you. In Japan, how this was determined is that the mayor of the prefecture, which is kind of like the county, is asked to give an estimate of the number of Ainu people in their community. So there is no way to really know how many Ainu there are. We had a student who's, she now has a PhD in anthropology. She's half Ainu. And she said when she was growing up, she did not know she was Ainu. And one day when she was about 11, she heard her mom and her aunts talking, and she couldn't understand what they were saying. And she asked her mother about this. And her mom said, if I tell you this, you are not allowed to tell anybody. You may not tell your best friend. You may not tell your cousins. You may not tell anyone. And she agreed. And she said, you are half Ainu. And the girl was horrified because, of course, she's heard horror stories about what Ainu are. And so her mother had to give her an entire family history and Ainu lesson and bring her into the culture that she knew nothing about starting when she was 11. And she had to keep this as a secret. And her PhD dissertation is in autoethnography that looks at her family history and her heritage and about the Ainu people. And the university didn't know what to do with this because they've never had anything like it. It did happen. She did get her PhD, but now she is looked at as being the authority on being Ainu at a university level, and it scares her. And she has kind of gone into hiding because all of those things of discrimination and then all of the positive things that are coming out of what the work has been for the past 20 years, she's the recipient of all of that. And it's been a horrible, horrible experience for her because she's alone in what she's doing, because there are not other Ainu scholars who have achieved what she has, who she can work with in order to take this forward. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. But she coined the phrase when she was talking about what it was like to be in hiding. I told her about the hidden Jews and about the hidden Jews in Mexico and what it was like for people and how they had practices in their home that other people didn't have, and they don't know where they came from. And all of a sudden she realized that maybe her history wasn't alone by herself, that this had happened in other places in the world. So she now talks about the hidden Ainu as part of her identity and as part of what is going on at this point.
So, contemporary issues that the Ainu are facing in Japan are very much consistent in terms of their education, that they're generally much lower. They don't finish high school as often. Economically, they receive less in terms of income, at least those that are recognized to be Ainu by the Hokkaido Ainu Association. Again, with many Ainu who actively stay hidden and are not public, it's uncertain what their levels of education and such are. But many of the issues that the Ainu are facing as one of the world's most recent indigenous populations are very similar to the issues that have been faced in Canada by First Nations there, here in the United States by American Indian groups, in Australia by the Australian Aboriginal groups, and even as far as in Sweden by the Sami. So many indigenous populations globally all share the same sorts of issues with discrimination, economic issues, education issues, health issues, all these things. And so at the moment, the Ainu are learning how to really utilize a global indigenous network with the immediacy of information on the internet, with the Japanese adoption of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and with much more outward-looking perspectives about looking to other groups for examples. The Ainu are becoming much more recognized both locally and globally as a group of indigenous people who have their own separate history and who are trying to come to grips with changing the discrimination that they have experienced over the course of at least 500 years in terms of working with the Meiji Japanese and on into the contemporary populations.
So it's all of these things that got us thinking that there needs to be a book, a very basic book that can provide people with an understanding of who the Ainu were, who the Ainu currently are, and the potential for where the future is going to be for this latest recognized community of Indigenous people. And it started out as a conversation back in about 2008, we should do something. And it got talked about a lot for many, many years. And Joe started outlining it and revising the outline and writing chapters and moving chapters and throwing away chapters. And then we had the opportunity he got invited to be a visiting professor at Hokkaido University at the Global Center for Indigenous Studies and Cultural Diversity, which was started by our colleague Harifumi Kato, who had originally invited us to Hokkaido back in 2007 to be a visiting professor. So here was this opportunity for a year-long stay in Hokkaido, which originally was come over, do your research, write your book. You'll have all the time in the world. You can do this as what you do while you're here. And he got there, and all of a sudden he found himself giving lectures and attending meetings and presenting at conferences, and the time for doing the book got smaller and smaller. And I said, you're not coming home until it's done. We went over and taught the field school in August of 2022. I went back over for teaching the field school in August of 2023, and he had the draft pretty much beaten out. Got home and ended up moving things a lot for one publisher who decided they weren't interested, sent it to UVA Press, and they went, oh my gosh, this is fabulous. And the rest is in the book, which is available on the table outside.
$25, $25.99 text.
But the idea was, write it and make it valuable not only in the United States, but also make it valuable in Japan, because that's where a lot of re-educating needs to happen. And so our next goal, hopefully, is to work with a couple of our former students who are now associate professors at 2 different universities, and our Ainu colleagues, to translate this into Japanese. And UVA Press was kind enough to give us the translation rights so that it could be published in Japan as well. And so really to take this information and get it out as broadly as possible.
With that, I think that we're done talking about what we've done. But we would be glad to answer any questions or to, yes, Paul. This Paul, not that Paul, or that Paul.
Thanks. 2 questions. So the recognition that happened in Japan at the official level that this community was out there, what kind of conversations were happening within the Japanese government or society that things should change, we should recognize these people? That's one question. And also, did that happen strictly from within Japan, or did interest on the part of foreign scholars like yourselves was that also a factor in the change of direction? And the second question is, what about the other lands where Ainu exists, like Sakhalin and maybe also in Siberia? Have you been able to have any interaction with Russian, Soviet scholars about that?
Answer to the first question. The Ainu started protesting for Ainu rights as early as 1997. So it's been on the radar for a long time. The Japanese government said, no, you're no different, you have all the rights in the world, why are you asking for more? Ultimately, a more liberal government came into power, and I think there was one Ainu individual who was a parliament member in the 1980s and 90s. But eventually, I'm not exactly sure why it happened at that time. There were a couple of court cases. 1997, the Japanese court decided, that's when they said that the Ainu are an indigenous population. Although that decision had a lot to do socially, it didn't have any effect on the government. But with that precedent set, it became easier for the Japanese government to make the pronouncement. At that time, the pronouncement really, it has no teeth to it. It's like, say, making Arizona, we could make an honorary Choctaw reservation since I live here. I mean, it has no real saying or no effect that I could say it as long as I wanted to. So I'm not sure exactly why 2007 had a magic date to it. I'm sure if I could get back into the newspapers, I might find more information. Or if I could sit down with Terry Tsunemoto, he might could tell me as well. The other question, I think I forgot what it was. Currently the Sahaline Ainu in the 1860s were moved to Hokkaido as a result of the Japanese-Russian treaty. Sahaline became Russian territory, and so the Ainu were moved to Hokkaido with the other Ainu. Eventually, most of the Sahaline Ainu went home. Currently, Russia does not have a governmental recognition of the Sahaline Ainu as separate from Russian people. The Sahaline Ainu and the Hokkaido Ainu do interact quite often. The people move back and forth, across the ocean there, the sea there. So, and we've met a couple of Russian Sahaline Ainu, and their clothing are different. You can recognize a Russian Sahaline Ainu just by the ornamentation on the clothing. So, and they do interact quite a bit with the other Ainu.
And the scholar side of it is that we have colleagues that we've worked with that are, what's the university up by Lake Baikal? Anyways, there's an exchange of Russian academics with Hokkaido regularly, and they work together. A lot of the reason is Hirofumi Kato did a lot of work in Russia up by Lake Baikal and has worked with a lot of the scholars there. So there is a back and forth between the two universities. And internationally, there's a lot of other scholars who have who work with indigenous cultures, who go back and forth and work with Ainu and with the Ainu researchers as well. The Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies brings in people who are working on topics related to Ainu and Ainu studies. So it's really quite open. Most of the field schools that we worked on were international in scope in both the instructors and also the participants. The field school that goes on Riboon Island every summer now is an international archaeological field school. It's open to anyone who's interested in working there. It's for credit or not for credit, and it's they have Ainu artisans and traditional cultural leaders who present, who participate, and it's quite an amazing thing if you know of anyone who would be interested in participating in that kind of thing.
Yes, ma'am.
I have 3 questions. I think the first two are pretty quick. Oh.
Do you mind using it?
Oh, sorry. So, 3 questions. I think the first 2 are pretty quick. When you asked, is this a matrilineal or patrilineal culture, you didn't tell us what the answer was.
Traditionally, it was matrilineal, so through the women. But over time, they've incorporated in, of course, the traditional Japanese patrilineal.
Okay, and to what extent is the language still alive?
Is to what extent?
The language still alive.
There's incredible language revitalization. There were a lot of audio tapes made of traditional language, and those have been archived and are now being brought out and being used to start reintroducing Ainu language. The Culture Center in Biratori, Nebutani, teaches language. So there's language classes for the community and down through the children. So it's becoming more and more revitalized. The town, the Raporo Ainu Nation has brought in other Ainu traditional leaders to help them with bringing back some of the tradition and the language in their community as well. So it's starting, but there's a good base because there was so much ethnographic documentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the third question is sort of, with this process of indigenization that's kind of ascendant, it just seems like that must kind of crash into the general trend all over Japan of rural depopulation and depopulation in general. How do these 2 things work together? Or against each other?
Yeah, very much an issue. But the majority of the Ainu people that I know really embrace living in a rural culture. They enjoy being out, working, doing what they do, fishing, trapping, hunting, farming. There is a large Ainu population both in Tokyo and in I'm sorry.
Another big city.
Another big, Osaka. There we go.
But those communities, in order to be recognized as Ainu by the Japanese government, you have to be on Hokkaido.
Well, maybe that's the upside of like less education for the Ainu, is they're wanting to stay. I mean, it seems like the more you get educated, the more you want to get the hell out of the small town.
I think a great deal of it is culture as well, cultural. I think that a lot of the people, as they learn more about their Ainu heritage, they really get caught up in the fervor of it. So most of the Ainu people that I've spoken with and got to know some quite well are very happy living in Hokkaido. They wouldn't want to move. They don't even want to live in Sapporo. Sapporo is a wonderful town, but it's not Biratori or wherever. So they do like staying home.
And the communities are very welcoming. We're archaeologists, we're anthropologists, we're used to walking into community and being the non-participant observer, sitting in the back and not really even being there and just letting things unfold in front of you. And it was pretty frightening the first time we went to community and we were watching the ceremonies going on and the elders come over and grab us and bring us up to the front to participate in what we were watching, and I wasn't watching that carefully. And it was such a different experience, but they really want people to know who they are and what their culture is, and they're very proud of it, and they want to share it. And if you make a mistake, it's okay.
Thank you, and then you.
There's been a lot of bear attacks in this area in the north. Has there been any reaction from the Ainu? Is there any ceremonial thing, or do they have any take on what's going on with the bears?
I think the bears, like anywhere else, are being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back into smaller and smaller environmental spaces. The archaeological site that we worked on in Shari Town, we ended up never being able to go back again because of the bears. The bears started coming down and roaming the streets of this town, and it was no longer safe to work on the site. Quite interestingly, this site was, it had epijomon pit structures, humongous pit houses. And, you know, they're 3,000 years old down at the bottom. And up on the upper layers, you have historic Ainu bear skulls from the ceremonies, and the inau, and which are the ceremonial, oh, there I am pointing at one that was from the historic use of this site. So they continue now, even today, to honor the bears and to celebrate them and to hold the ceremonies on the same places that their ancestors did. About how they feel about the bears and attacks and all of that, I don't know. I don't know if they have anything that they're practicing culturally. Traditionally, the bear ceremony, they would get a baby bear, a cub, and they'd bring it to their community, and for 2 years they'd raise it like one of their children. And then they would hold the bear ceremony to honor the bear and the ancestors. They're not allowed to do that anymore. That was one of the things that was made illegal. So I'm not sure what kind of ceremony has taken that place other than to continue doing the ceremony to the ancestors, which has pretty much, from what we can tell, most of the components except for the bear.
Yeah, they have, they have ceremonies to honor the ancestors. There's ceremonies for the first salmon. There's ceremonies set in the spring, but I've only participated in the ceremony for the first salmon and ceremonies for the ancestors.
Do the Ainu have a distinct creation story? Is that something they talk about or share with you?
They do have distinct creation stories. They have about 3 or 4 different ones. And many of the stories are told in the form of a song. And so they'll sing the song and it can last for 3 or 4 hours. I don't know, trying to think. The English version of an Ainu origin story has not been shared with me. Or if it has, there was too much sake and I don't remember. The Japanese do love sake, and I do too. So.
It's really not a problem. The origin stories specifically haven't been shared. A lot of the other ceremonies mostly revolve around the ancestors and the bear, and these are all gods, and they're called kamui. Kamui is the word for God. And so there's ceremonies that revolve around the salmon, the bear, the environment around the ancestors, and and you continue to feed these things nutrients. Real food. They put food out in front of the sticks. At the fire, they drip the raw sake that turns into smoke that takes the messages up to the gods. So that's what's been shared with us.
Did you have?
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Carol. Great presentation. Looking forward to reading the book. You know, as you guys know, I can't help myself but critiquing government policy and whatnot. And the mention of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I was kind of wondering how you would grade Japan for its adherence, adoption, implementation of that principles and articles in that declaration, because I don't hear much in what you're saying about them doing much by way of walking that talk.
I would say that I would grade the Japanese government about equal to the United States government. So a 0. Yeah, because the Japanese government says, oh, we do that anyway. Sovereignty? No, the Ainu don't need sovereignty. We know what's good for them. The Japanese would say that the Ainu have sovereignty, as much sovereignty as any other Japanese citizen, so therefore they're equal. So they're living up to the spirit of the declaration. You know, it's a matter of interpretation, but I would say the Japanese government, looking at it from a non-Japanese citizen, they're doing absolutely nothing. And you know, they recognize what it says, but they're not making any policy changes. They are not providing any concept of sovereignty for the Ainu in relation to natural resources, to animal resources, to being able to self-govern themselves. So in that regard, it was signing on the dotted line, nothing more.
And I'm going to try to be positive here. I'm going to drop a little positive note in here and say this is less than 20 years old. And it feels like a really long time that this has been coming for a long time. But in actuality, this is still very young. It's young in the process, and they're still trying to figure this out. The records for many Ainu people were burned in a huge fire. How do you recognize people when you don't know? Do you look at DNA? Well, DNA does not equal culture. How do you trust self-identification? If you start giving money out to Ainu to be able to go to college, because less Ainu go to college, how do you know that other people aren't just going to say, hey, here's free money, I'm going to be Ainu today? They're caught in trying to figure out how to move this forward, and I think that it's maybe overly cautious, but it's going to take time, and I have hope. We have a start. That's what I like to take into consideration.
Thanks for that.
Any other questions?
Lots.
I'll go back to you then.
To what degree is the situation of the Ainu similar or different from the people in the Ryukyu Islands, who speak a different form of Japanese entirely, ethnically, there are variants with the mainstream?
Well, the Ryukyuans are really a totally different reality, if you will, because the Ryukyuan was a separate kingdom. It was conquered by Japan in the 1500s. So it had its own government, it had its own army, it was self-operating. When the Japanese conquered it and took it over, as they say, to the victor go the spoils. The Ryukyuan population on Okinawa and in that area are really trying to regain their independence.
One thing that I've noticed online is that the Chinese government has some web pages questioning Japanese authority over the Ryukyus.
Well, in the past, the Ryukyuan islands were middlemen between China and the Japanese, which is why the Japanese came down, conquered them to cut off China's access. So with that conquest, the Japanese government has said, basically, we beat you fair and square. But they're still open for negotiation, I'm sure. I hope. I mean, right now, everybody's in Okinawa, the US, and so I'm not sure how soon that's going to change, but there has been a movement, very definitely for the last 75 years, for Ryukyuans to go back to severing from Japan.
Nice.
Take it to the back.
So this is a big ski area. Is the Ainu participating? Are they getting jobs in the ski area? Or do they like the ski area? Is that sort of interfering with their mountains and stuff?
Very Arizona question.
It's not like the snowball. I'm uncertain that the Ainu have a distinction in relation to the skiing. I've never really asked an Ainu individual. At Lake Akan is there is a village there, an Ainu village there, that was created in the 1950s. A person around who had property on Lake Akan said, we can use this for tourism. So he invited quite a few families from around Hokkaido to come live in Lake Akan, practice their arts and crafts. He showed them a German Bavarian bear and said, you guys should start carving these. And that's the origin of the Ainu bear carvings that have been pretty much considered to be the Ainu thing. So there is a large ski area there at Lake Akan, but again, I don't know whether there's any plus or minus perceptions about it. Anyone in the back? Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I vaguely remember there was some kind of movement that Ainu people or group of people are trying to not to use the word Ainu because Ainu, I thought that their own language means human, and that's another way of the Wajin perspective of them Japanese people calling this group of people to distinguish. And so, have you met anybody who are kind of resisted to be called Ainu, or if you can elaborate that?
There's Lake Akan. I have not met any individuals who complained about being called Ainu. I think it's become like, I grew up American Indian. I've always been American Indian. But there are quite a few younger individuals who say, well, you know, that's disgusting, because that's wrong. We're not from India, we're Native American. And then I say, well, my wife was born in America, she's native born American, so what's the difference? So I think early on, the Japanese description was I know, which means dog in Japanese. And so for many people early on, it was like calling them dogs. And so I think that was where a lot of the problems came out between Ainu, I know, and Inu, which is another word for dog. So, you know, currently I think there's no negative aspect to the term Ainu that I know of.
The other thing I'm going to throw in here is that calling the indigenous people of Hokkaido Ainu is kind of like calling all the 587 Native American tribal communities Native American. Traditionally, each of these, there were individual bands, individual groups of Ainu people, and they organized themselves along the rivers, which went from the mountain down to the sea. And so if you can imagine these different sectors of the island of Hokkaido, the different communities of Ainu used, occupied, and worked within these different riverine systems. And each of those bands would have been their own community with different language variations. They could probably all recognize, but they had their own dialect. So to call everybody Ainu as one group of people is like calling all of the different tribal communities here Native American.
Any other questions?
Thank you.